All right. Well, it's 1:31, and I know we have the art of being human is a lot of ground to cover. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And thank you all so much for joining us today and sharing your time with us and hopefully some of your expertise in the chat. We love an active chat. We'll try to pull out comments and conversation and pull you in as much as we can. Um, and I'm sure you've been listening to us talk here about all the different experiences and opportunities that we've had. And we really do, all of us, when we come together in our schools and in our classrooms, we really do bring that variety with us. And as educators, we have the honor and the challenge to support and grow all of our students, and thinking about how we can get them to their fullest potential. And so that's kind of what we're calling the art of being human. We were all talking in several when we were planning, and as we saw each other's expertise and our backgrounds and experiences, it really came together into this palette of experiences and opportunities. And so that's kind of how we landed on this. I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next slide. And I screen shared backwards today, so my screen shares on my left screen, not my right screen. I have to look for it. Want to take just a minute and have a land acknowledgement for where we are. Today, those of us representing Capital Region ESD 113 acknowledge that our main building in Tumwater is on the traditional land of the Nisqually, the Cowlitz, and the Puget Sound Salish people. We ask that each of you to show gratitude to the tribal nations where you are currently located. Please share it in the chat if you'd like. We acknowledge the commitment of all Pacific Northwest tribes to the resurgence of their traditional ways and their respect and protection of all peoples, not only those who are living, but also those who have gone before and who are yet to be born. We pay our respect to the elders of the past and the present, and to a valued resource the tribes have defined as their children. They are the tribe's future, and they are the future for us all. We raise our hands to all sovereign tribes who have stewarded these beautiful lands throughout the generations. And I'm going to take a quick peek in the chat because I would love to see some of the places that we're hearing one step at a time. So thank you all for joining. A little bit, I'm going to do just a quick introduction on each one of us that are here today, and then I'm sure as we go through our presentation, you'll get to know us each a little bit better. Tammy Woodard is with us today. She is our professional learning coach at ESD 113 and everything MTSS. Carrie Blankenship is our regional administrator for early learning and also special education, and an amazing resource. And Karen Tranum is our regional administrator for behavior, and I learn from her every day. And then I am Jen Flo. I'm the regional administrator for advanced learning and new teacher support, so connecting with new teachers. I'm not going to do it today, Tammy. This is all you.
I was waiting. So our goals for today, you can see that slide, but it is to appreciate the uniqueness of the human brain and trauma responses. Jen's going to talk about that. This was amazing stuff to listen to yesterday, but parts of the amazing brain, the impact of trauma on brain development, and the impact of neurotransmitters and our brain's response. And then Karen and I both cover some pieces on understanding that all behavior is communication and tiered systems of support, hierarchy of needs, skills development. And I love this, that maladaptive behavior is behavior that is learned incorrectly. And then Carrie will be talking about recognizing that there's a menu of best practices to create a trauma-invested classroom. I love this part because it's like we're not just leaving you out there with, well, we've all experienced trauma and this is how it impacts our brain. Now what? Carrie goes over some very definitive best practices of what we do about that and how we lead kids along through MTSS interventions. Also looking at our standards and what does that mean and how do we develop things with regards to that. And Jen talks about establishing relationships with students and that strong developmental relationship. And Karen will also cover matching function and support for students. When we talk about, she's going to talk, I love this, about WTF. And when we understand that all behavior is communication, then to understand the function of that behavior. And she does a great job. It's a lot. So one of the things that we've done, and I will drop this in the chat, both of these links, there's a link to a Google form in which we want to collect some of your contact information. We want to send out, we've got resources that we will send out at the end of this. We are also developing a school year long PD to support you through the year for these very topics. As you saw by our goals for today, that's a lot to cover in an hour and a half. It's a very high level overview and a little taste. And so if it's something that is of interest to you and you want some deeper dives into this information, we are developing this PD and you will be supported through that over the school year. And so there's the link to sign up with PD Enroller. But the thing that we'd really love for you to do today before this session is over is to go to the Google form and give us your contact information. And that way we can send you our slide deck, we can send you resources, and we can also give you more information about the PD series that we are developing. And I will drop, oh, it looks like Carrie dropped both of those in the chat already. So you'll see the link for the form as well as the link for the PD Enroller course.
So when we started talking about all of this and thinking about the work that we wanted to share and the art of being human, I kept being drawn back to a student of mine that I had, and I'm going to call him Jay. And the connection we need to have with our students is so important. He came into my room, and when I met him, his guard was already up. He was not a fan of collaboration, nor was he a fan of elaboration. He would tuck himself into his hoodie and just kind of tuck himself away as far as he could. When I would try to engage with him as a teacher, or even just to connect with him, he would withdraw quite a bit. And I discovered that he didn't have a tolerance for mistakes and errors. He held himself to a really, really high standard. But through some trial and error, and I wish I would have had some of Karen's knowledge back then, I found that he would tell me more if I would talk with him instead of asking him to write, because writing to him felt very permanent and he couldn't change it. And he had to look at what he was imagining in his mind versus what he was putting on the paper, and they weren't aligned. So we spent some good part of the year learning about each other and getting along. And I finally started to know that I was connecting with him because I used to open my classroom on Tuesdays for lunch, and kids could come in anytime, sit with me. It was kind of like my day to spend some time with them. And it was probably about February that I found him kind of lurking outside the door. And he had a reason to come in and get a coat or a pencil, just something that, is really common. But he came in and he didn't leave. He stayed with us. And so started to see the slow building relationship. And it really took time for him to get to know me and trust me and to establish that trust. And then also for that. And after that, I won't say we fixed everything, but we began to make progress. And we began to make those connections. And so I think about him as a human and all the complex things that were happening for him. Sometimes I would call it my tough nut to crack. Oh, Tammy, I think you're
I am muted. I love the quote by Abraham Lincoln as well as this quote, because even though Jen used the phrase tough nut to crack, and that's not necessarily what we're doing, what she was implying, though, was the right idea, that it's about getting to know our students and having that relationship. And we see all kinds of statistics about how far students can come with just that one strongly developed relationship. And I equate this, I love, if you saw Goldie Muhammad's keynote on the first day, I really connected these two slides to her presentation where she talked about that we facilitate genius, and that when we think of students as having genius, then we cultivate it. And that if we show them genius, then they can become genius. And I loved her statement about, we do not call or label students by their deficit. We don't call them by what they are not, but by what they are. And so that's where this quote comes from. Too often we look for failure.
So I think she was reading the quote, too often we look for failure and aim to fix it, whereas we need to look for success and scale it. And thinking about how we can build those capacities and using the assets of the students and the strengths that they come with to support their area.
Of looking and how.
So Tammy, I think you were freezing. I don't know if it froze for everyone.
Or, oh yeah, they said lost. Oh, Rebecca's saying lost the sound.
Okay, so I think you're coming in and out. You're back. Rebecca says you're back.
I'm back. Okay, yay.
Welcome back.
Thanks. Okay, so let's just move on to you.
Okay. So we're going to use, before we get started really diving in deep, I want to take just a minute and look at some of the brain and some of what's happening, because it's not only the external factors that are happening for students, but there are internal pieces that are happening as well. And emotional trauma has an impact on their brain development, and stress and cortisol change that look. The first time I saw this image by Dr. Bruce Perry, this is an image of two 3-year-olds, and the brain of the 3-year-old on the left is a neurotypical student, and the brain on the right is another 3-year-old that has experienced severe trauma. And you can see there are significant differences in their brain development and how they will be able to function and how they will be able to support their own learning in the school, and thinking that they were not necessarily going to have the same coping skills and supports that they need to in our classroom. So that was a very powerful and mind-changing image for me, to think about how my students were presenting themselves in the class, that they weren't always necessarily doing something to me or to even connect with me inappropriately, but it was something that they may not have had the ability to do that piece yet. So I needed to scaffold my learning and kind of change how I thought about that. I also want to talk just a little bit about neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to change itself, because it continues to grow and evolve. And I think that's one of the most fabulous things about our brain, in that it doesn't stay that way. It does evolve, and it has this ability to continually, even as adults, to continue to grow and evolve and change. And so I'm going to play just a couple minutes of this video just to kind of highlight the beauty and the complexity of our brain.
A nerve cell or neuron. This neuron is shown 20,000 times larger as in reality. At this tremendous magnification, a hair would be 6 feet thick. These incredible organic chips function through electric signals. They control nearly everything we do, from thinking to moving muscles, from sensing to hearing, and even watching this video. The thin extensions at the top of the neuron are called dendrites. These dendrites receive signals from other neurons. As long as the inhibiting blue signals dominate, the neuron will remain silent. But as soon as the activated red signals dominate, an electric pulse is sent through the thick lower tube of the neuron. This tube is called the axon of the neuron. Neurons are not alone. The brains of a human contain 100 billion neurons. If we were to walk through a single human brain at this pace, it would take over 300 years to just take a glimpse at all the neurons.
To me, to think about if it would take that far to walk, if we could, walk through 100 billion neurons in our mind or in our brains, and then think about how quickly signals go through those neurons and how quickly we make decisions and adjust our actions. It's really complex and it's really beautiful to think about. And I think about how many ways that can shift for us or for students. And so kind of goes back to the art of being human. Something else I want to share before we dive in a little bit deeper.
A nerve cell or neuron.
Not that one, is a little bit of the reticular activating system. This guy is always on stage and he's always looking out for, as our sentry and as our concierge. The reticular activating system is always scanning for us and always looking for things that are happening around us, trying to decide for your brain if it's important for you to pay attention to or if it's not important to pay attention to. I'm thinking around just in my space right now, it's actually, usually I have dogs barking and neighbors mowing their grass, but actually right now it's so eerily quiet that I'm wondering what's going on. It's more like the absence of sound has got my reticular activating system kind of on guard. So, but it's always on the lookout, and it is the first filter for your brain to think about what it is it should be paying attention to. So take a minute, just a second, pause, listen around you, smell, your sense of smell. What are you seeing? What are you smelling? What are you hearing? What are you feeling? It could be hot. You may feel a drip of sweat rolling down your cheek or something, but share what is happening around you that is in the background that your brain is not paying attention to, but it is. Tammy says the ice machine is making ice. Lauren says the wind is rustling. Clocks are ticking, dogs are putting themselves into shapes, and her collars are jiggling. And there are certain sounds that you pay attention to or are signals for us and become those activating points, those triggers for us to think about. There are fans blowing, and if your fan stops blowing, it probably takes your attention away. Your brain's not, it's determining that as it's blowing, it's not important, but what if it stops? Hearing air conditioners and taste strawberry mint tea. Yum. That sounds good. So your reticular activating system is always paying attention. And when you think about what it might be paying attention before we come to school, when we're at school, and maybe even anticipating what we should be paying attention to before we go home. It also has a second role, and that is a concierge, and it tends to bring you the things that it perceives. So if you are perceiving that you are lucky and that these opportunities are there for you, it tends to draw those opportunities to you. You may have heard of somebody who, is lucky, or that good things always happen to you. But it's just that their reticular activating system is actually scanning for them and looking for those opportunities. But it can also work against us if we're emphasizing those areas that we have need. We'll find those instead. So the reticular activating system and what we're scanning for, and then also amygdala hijack. I don't know. I think it's a term we've all heard, but it's that instinct we have of flight, fight, freeze, or appease, where our reticular activating system is going to the amygdala and it's saying, this is urgent and you need to pay attention to it. And it's a survival instinct. It's quite often based on emotion when you feel fear, excitement, anticipation, um, any of those, but it does that hijack for you. It shuts off your prefrontal cortex and prevents you from accessing your executive functions because you're going into that survival mode. My example here is when I was learning to teach my very first class, they taught us how to tie a figure-8 knot, which you can see on the screen. And then they challenged us to climb a 200-foot rock wall. And so with the new knowledge that we had, and with this experience of course you can do this, and here's the language you need, they gave us a couple of terms, and then they sent us on our way and had us go climb a 200-foot wall. And that feeling of having to trust my new knowledge and the information that I just received and to perform this task in front of others has stuck with me as a new teacher. And that flight, fight, freeze, or appease all happened at the same time for us. And Tammy builds a nice connection to the supports when we think about our students' needs, the supports that they will need going forward.
So you've probably seen these graphics, and I just like to make the point that MTSS, many of us can say, I was listening to Elise and her UDL presentation this morning, and oftentimes we're like, oh, another new thing, but I've been trained in this, or I've been taught that. And really what MTSS is a framework for those tiered systems that many of us have learned and been using. So positive behavior supports, mental health is very much a tiered framework, academics with RTI, social emotional learning, and like Elise was talking this morning, even UDL is a tier 1 support design. And so what the state is doing with this initiative is just saying, instead of us all having been siloed in these things, we've created a framework now where these tiered systems can come in and actually work together, and we can be looking at the whole child of each of the children sitting in our classroom and how we can best teach and support them. And so I will drop a link in the chat if you want just some lovely nightly reading. This graphic came from the OSPI document that is the implementation document for MTSS. And what I just like to point out about this particular graphic, these are the 5 components of an MTSS framework that OSPI has said, you know, if you're going to implement MTSS well, you must have these 5 components. And it makes sense. The first one is team-driven shared leadership. We can all acknowledge and say things, other initiatives and things that have come into our school buildings or our district, and it was really brought sort of by one person, or there was one champion of that initiative. And then when that person left, it's like, well, what happened with that? And what are we doing with that? And so for quality implementation of anything, you need tiered, team-driven shared leadership for that. And then data-based decision-making. We have to be able to assess where are we, and then have we moved forward, and what does that look like? And family, student, and community engagement. And one of the statements that I like to make around this is that engagement piece, it is more than us saying to our families, to our stakeholders, to our community, we've created this, will you come put your stamp of approval on it? But it's really that we invite them to the table to have a voice in the creation of those things. And the continuum of supports, which is a lot of what you're going to get that high level of today. And then evidence-based practices, which we will cover some of that today as well. So those are what has been established as the 5 components of the MTSS framework. And this is one of my favorite graphics. Every child who winds up doing well has had at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive adult. And Jen's going to jump into that a little bit more, but that trying to, what Jen had shared before, if we're looking at that deficit model and that, oh, I'm coming in to fix them, or they're broken, or that sort of thing, it's like just pulling the top off the dandelion. And we all know what happens with that. It doesn't get to the root of the problem. And so really, even in what Karen's going to share about understanding the function of behavior, what is really going on. All behavior is communicating something, and really what that student more than likely needs is a better and more effective way of communicating the need that they are needing to have met. And yet they've never been taught that. They haven't learned that. And so it is our job to do that for them. And then we get to the root of those issues. And we're not viewing children's behavior as they are doing something to us, but viewing it as they are trying to communicate to us a need that needs to be met.
Thanks, Tammy. So in order to get down to the root of what causes our behavior, we need to learn how to look at things through a different perspective and an intentional lens. And so I'm going to use the analogy of photography to dive into this a little bit, because I love photographs. I've my whole life always had an abundance of pictures and love taking them and things like that. But the trick with photography is that great photos don't just happen. When you see an amazing picture of people or a setting or a landscape, if it's a masterful photograph, there's been some work that's gone into that. There's a lot of detail planning that goes into the photographer needs to know what they want to capture, and they have to have an idea of what they want the composition to look like on the other side. In other words, the quality of the shot is defined by the preparation that the photographer puts in, and it's achieved through attending to details like lighting and location and time of day and which lens do they use to shoot it, and how they support their imaging. And so to dive into this, we're going to first look at an analogy of skill acquisition in academics rather than social emotional. Most people are a little bit more familiar with academic standards than they are with social emotional standards or skills. And so Jen, if you would go to the next slide, we're going to take a look at the area of reading. And so for this presentation, we are going to assume that the core lesson was successful and the learning had been clearly defined and guided by a knowledge and application of grade level standards and some best practices in teaching. We're going to assume that it was an ideal quality tier 1 lesson. And what happens is, after we go through some of those instructions, we get the report. Mara doesn't perform as expected in reading. And yet, what does that mean? Okay, she doesn't perform well in reading, but what do we do with that? Oftentimes we'll take her into Title I and we'll put her in this program, whatever that might be over here with this para who's teaching it. And it's an all-in-one program. It's, she's going to work on her comprehension, and there's a little bit of vocabulary stuff in there, and they do some writing and a journal each week. And that's going to be our fix. Like that's what we're going to focus on. And yet we don't know what her skill is. So on the screen here, you see 3 basic categories, broader categories within the really broad category of reading. So when we look at these, we're going to drill down, and let's just look at maybe some of the skills that fall into this subcategory of basic reading. Jen, will you go to the next slide? Thank you. So here are some of those skills that fall into this subcategory of basic reading. And when we look at this, there are a lot of different things happening here. And so just saying that Mara struggles with basic reading still does not tell us the level of where her skills are at. What skill is she struggling with? What level is she reading at? We need to be able to drill in a little bit farther before we can start providing intervention that is going to be effective. Effective intervention relies on some strategic and targeted interventions. Jen, if you would go to the next slide, we're going to look at phonemic awareness in this. So here we see the 5 levels of phonological awareness. And so there are several skills here that we see leading up to phonemic awareness. So if we say the student has a phonemic awareness deficit, there is a lot of steps in progressing to being at grade level expectation or proficient in phonemic awareness. Jen, if you would go click again, we're going to look a little bit further into the skills that make up this phonemic awareness. So in order to be proficient in phonemic awareness, a student needs to be able to do each one of these skills to be considered proficient. If we don't drill down and find out what the root cause of the student's struggle in reading is, we can be missing or misaddressing a skill deficit entirely. So if our student maybe understands phoneme isolation, but is having trouble segmenting their words, they're not understanding syllables or roots and affixes, that can lead to some basic reading struggles that we might misdiagnose as comprehension issues because they're not understanding the meaning of words. We really need to drill down. If we don't drill down, Jen, if you would go to the next slide, it's like we're standing back and saying, oh, there's a beach with shells on it. And somebody says, well, what kind of shells are they? They're shells, right? Like they're pink shells, right? But if we don't zoom in and take a closer look at it, we can't tell you what kind of shells they are. When we zoom in, Jen, if you go to the next slide, we can see they're not all pink shells. There are white shells, there's pink shells, there's brown shells, and they are from very different varieties of shellfish. And so we have to get down to this more granular perspective of what are the skills that our students need so that we can provide strategic attention to those skills. If you would go to the next slide, Jen. Thank you. Another aspect of detail that we need to pay attention to is the aspect of time. This example here is a social emotional standard. And this excerpt that you're looking at is from the Teaching Strategies Gold. Teaching Strategies Gold is the company that produces the WA Kids assessment that we use for all kindergartners when they enter our school system. This excerpt in particular comes from their gold objectives for development and learning. And this is just one component of one area in that assessment. So we're looking at the social emotional skill of following limits and expectations, which is a component of regulating one's own emotions and behaviors. So this is similar to being able to follow directions in the classroom. So what we're seeing here is the component of time. These progressions from left to right, on the bottom, you will see different bands which represent time frames where students may be developing skills. And so those are correlated to ages. We won't get into all of that right now, but you can also see across the top, the descriptions that are written out there are descriptions of what this skill development may look like at different stages. And it also informs the progression of which this skill is acquired. So if we have a student who can't follow directions in third grade, we need to understand what is the breakdown. Why aren't they able to follow directions? Is it because they aren't able to follow 2 steps at one time? Is it because they can't keep them in sequential order? There's different elements we can look at here, but this will tell us where the student is at. What can they do? We need to identify that, because that will help us know where to go next with them. And so you can also see from this, within one skill of following limits and expectations, doing what you're told, following directions, there are a lot of micro skills within there that inform that larger skill. And we need to drill down to that micro level, get really granular. Jen, if you would go to the next slide. This is an excerpt from the Social Emotional Standards for Washington State. Again, this is just one standard within that. But most teachers, when I tell them that there are standards for social emotional learning, it's like a news flash. Like they're not aware that they're out there. And how can you teach something if you don't know what you're supposed to be teaching? How can you be looking for something if you don't know what you're looking for? It's really hard to figure out. We have to get our teachers to be looking at our standards to inform what they're expecting of our kids so that it's developmentally appropriate, but also so that we can provide these interventions for our kids and know where a breakdown is happening. You'll see on this standard at the bottom, there is somewhat of a time aspect here. It gives you some indicators of what this skill might look like at different stages in our education system. I don't love this visual representation of it, and I have another one that I'll show you later. But it's really important that if we are going to provide intervention for our social emotional learning, that we be looking at what is expected and how do those skills develop. Once we know that, we can also provide more effective tier 1 instruction that's embedded within the course of the day in the things that we're already doing. We won't have to buy a separate curriculum or do something different or extra, because we'll know what we are supposed to be teaching and what we are looking for and what is appropriate for our kids. And so we can call that out throughout the course of the day as it arises, and those really authentic learning opportunities on the playground or in group work in the classroom or during story time or wherever that may be in the lunchroom. And so I encourage you to dive into this a little bit more. If you'll go to the next slide, Jen. There's some additional resources here that will come in the slide deck. You'll see those 3 bullet pointed items. Those are some different representations. The social emotional learning standards are part of that Common Core adoption that every state does. Every state has social emotional learning standards. And they are similar, if not the same. And Illinois and Wisconsin just have 2 different representations of the same information. I just appreciated one of them more than the other. And so I thought I would share a couple of different ways with you in case you like to see information differently. The Yardsticks book is a book on development and of child development that goes age according to age. And so what you can look in there and see is what is typical expectation for development in social emotional skills for a child at any age. And it just gives you a point of reference. It's a really easy tool to use, quick for referencing, very friendly layout. I really like that tool. There's also the Handbook of Social Emotional Learning that again breaks down how skills are acquired, when they're acquired, things like that. And then there's a research paper up there at the top for reference as well. Those links are all embedded. And yes, I see someone said that even as a parent, they gave it away. They gave it away. It is a really useful tool and it helps. They pass out yardsticks brochures on back to school night. Yes, it is so helpful for our teachers and our parents, but especially in the classroom, to know what is appropriate for our kids. Is what we're actually looking for in their behavior appropriate for their age and for their development? And that's not even considering if they have a disability or some sort of impairment or the impacts of trauma. Keep in mind that the impact of trauma can slow development in this area. There's also cultural context to take into consideration. What we may expect in an Americanized perspective of social norms may not be what a child has experienced within the cultural context of their family. They may have different expectations. So we really have to kind of break through these barriers and engage in some conversations with parents and really learn about what is that culturally relevant perspective that we need to take. And so I think I have one more slide here, and this is where we're going with this. So I mentioned before that when photographers take a great photograph, they have to have something to support their camera. Some photographers have those really amazing, incredibly long telephoto lenses that they use like to support their shots in sports. Those cost thousands of dollars. Most photographers rely on a good old tripod. It helps just stable the camera. And if you're going to put together a great composition of time-lapse photos or anything like that, it allows you to keep your camera in the exact same position to capture all of those images for layering later. In our work of this social emotional and having this trauma-informed lens in our work, culturally responsive, the base of our work is relationships. And it's relationships with each and every student as an individual, with individual families, with individual students, because you're not going to get this granular level of understanding about where your kids are unless you know them individually, unless you know their story. You cannot replace the value of a relationship with your student with any, what's the word I'm looking for? Standardized assessment, standardized screening tool, anything. Relationship is really where you need to begin your work. And Jen is going to take us into developing those relationships.
That was a beautiful handoff. I have been following the Search Institute for several years, and you may have seen the developmental assets that they released several years ago, which are about the internal and external assets that students require. But they actually just released some research on the importance of building assets and building those developmental relationships. And so we're going to take a few minutes to dive into what are the elements of a developmental relationship and exactly what is a developmental relationship. How do we know this is a relationship that can affect a student and maybe potentially change the projection that they're on? So before we dive into it, we're going to go forward, not backwards. I'm going to ask you to kind of think back to your youth and don't type. You can type in the chat, but don't push enter. We're going to try something like a chat waterfall here in just a second, and we're going to flood the chat. But who in your past showed you that you mattered to them, or pushed you to keep getting better, or kept you on task to achieve your goals? Who may have treated you with respect, gave you a say in some of the decisions that were being made, and had high expectations for you? Who connected you with people and places and ideas that broadened your world? So let's take a minute, and I'm going to invite everyone to think for just a moment about who that might be and share something in the chat, but don't push enter yet. All right. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. I see children. I see aunts. I see high school English teachers, grandmas, coaches. Some of these are in school. Some of these are out of school, where we're finding and making those connections to relationships. 4th grade teachers, band teachers, dads, parents. So it can be someone from within your family. It can be people outside of your family. I'm holding, this is my fidget. It's actually a piece of olivine. It's a rock from an 8th grade science teacher that I had. And I have held on to it. I won't say how many years it is, but it's been a while. But thinking about things that have connected you and showed you that you matter. And when you think about the elements of those relationships, that's kind of what we're going to talk about for just a little bit today. The Search Institute defines a developmental relationship. It's reciprocal. It goes both ways. Both partners both benefit from the relationship. It is trustworthy. It's purposeful. And it helps young people discover who they are, to develop the abilities that shape their lives and learn how to engage and contribute to the world around them. And as I look at this definition, I'm drawn to the verbs. I'm always drawn to the actions. It helps them to discover, develop, shape, learn, engage, and contribute, which are all the attributes I think that we want for our student kids growing up and going forward. We want them to have that ability and the confidence and the knowledge and self-reliance to do that. So how do we get there, and how do we do that with our relationships? So the Search Institute studied 14,000 4th grade through middle school students, and they found that the percentage of youth with strong developmental relationships decreases over time. You'll notice the orange category is the strong developmental relationships. And I think one of the things that I found most telling in this graph is that even at elementary school, we are at just 62% of our students are experiencing strong relationships with an adult or with others. And that means we have an opportunity to find and support 40%, but that continues to decrease over time. By the time they're at high school, they are not feeling connected. 20% have feeling like they don't have that strong relationship. And conversely, those that are in elementary school that are feeling like they have the weakest developmental relationship, that number has doubled by the time we've gone to high school. We have gone from almost like 4 to 5% to 10 to 15%. And so having those opportunities to connect. There are 5 components to a developmental relationship. The first one to look at is expanding possibilities and the opportunities there. This is how we connect with other people and how we make opportunities happen for them. Are you connecting them with a mentor? Are you connecting them with someone who has a similar interest? If you were like me and liked rocks, could you connect me with someone, or could you be that person for me? So connecting them with opportunities, helping them make those connections. Are you expressing care? Are you letting students know that they matter to you, that you're providing support for them, you're helping them navigate systems, you're offering to listen and then active listening where you're giving information back to them? Are you also sharing power? We hear a lot about including student voice and choice in our classrooms, but are you letting them lead and letting them find those opportunities where they can make those suggestions and add to the classroom opportunities? Are you also providing support that helps them and scaffolds that help them complete the tasks, and also letting them take those risks? Are you creating that environment for the safe risks and challenging their growth? I often hear Zaretta Hammond talk about warm demanders, and this idea that you can have empathy, but you can also hold students to high expectations. And so balancing both of those and challenging them to grow, and also having the confidence that they can grow and they can do hard things, and knowing that they will be successful. I think it's also important to stop and celebrate those moments of success. Not to just check them off and say, we did it, and move on to the next challenge, but to actually stop and reflect and have those opportunities to engage in their growth. 5% of the 14,000 students that were surveyed, and in this research, 5% of them reported that they were experiencing discrimination or bias from their teachers and program staff. But what stood out to me more in the study was that 20% of the youth reported experiencing this discrimination or bias from their peers. So it's important, as we think about how we're engaging in this work and connecting everyone together, that we think about how they are with adults, but also with students, and how our culture of our schools may need to be kind of looked at, and think about how we might engage them there. We have to have multi-facets of our work. Students that have these strong relationships are also 21 times more likely to manage their emotions well. They have that support and they have those 5 attributes. And so they're more likely to manage their emotions well in the face of trauma and stress. And they also are 17 times more likely to take personal responsibility for their actions. So they have the skills and the necessary opportunities to develop and go forward. So I want to pause for a moment, and this is just a quick overview, but I like the term possibility thinking, and I want to create an invitation for you for some possibility thinking. I often say possibilities instead of suggestions, because suggestions come with a connotation or an expectation that you have to take an idea or you have to take an action on something that you propose. But when we create space for possibility thinking, we allow for maybe, maybe not. It has a little bit more flexibility in our mindset. So I'm going to invite you for some possibility thinking, that as you consider these 5 elements of expressing care, challenging growth, productive boundaries, sharing power, and expanding possibilities, what structures and systems support those relationships in your school or in your classroom? What are some actions or activities that are supporting those strong relationships? We're going to take a minute just to think on our own, and then please share a comment in the chat or even an idea of something that you're doing. And we're not doing the waterfall chat, so go ahead whenever you have something you'd like to share. What structures and systems could support the development of relationships? Morning meetings and justice circles, class jobs, postcards over spring break and at the end of the school year, and handwritten amber. That's fabulous. Mindfulness lessons, movement breaks, sharing gratitudes, get to know you activities and class conversations. I also think of opportunities to that you might engage in the community and invite the community in or extend a relationship there. Creating rules together, golden tickets for kindness. Taking time with students to talk away from instruction time, really finding those opportunities to get to know you. I think about the young man who lurked outside my classroom. Story buddies for one-to-one support. Asking students what they think, connecting with mentors. We used to have classroom buddies where we would pair different grades together. So making those connections, teaching how to solve personal and social conflicts. Absolutely. Lots of structures and systems and opportunities that we have to create those relationships with students. So the developmental relationships framework from the Search Institute, they have a one-page, and I'm going to drop it into the chat here in just a second, but they have a one-page description of the elements of it and the actions that you can take and also the definitions. So they'll have some very specific actions. Thank you, Tammy. So thinking about all the different ways that you can do it and how that can be included for students.
Okay, so that looks like me. You did a wonderful job, Jen. Thanks for all that information. I wanted to read a quote that I like sharing with people. Behind every behavior, there is a feeling, and beneath each feeling is a need. And when we meet that need, rather than focus on the behavior, we begin to deal with the cause, not the symptoms. So quite often, we are dealing with symptoms and we are not dealing with what the cause of the behavior is. And as I tell people all the time, that you need to know what causes it. If you cannot get to the function of the behavior, it doesn't make much sense. And my job here at the ESD is to provide a lot of one-on-one student support when schools have gone as far as they can go, where they're just not seeing behavior change. I get a call. Most of the time when I get a call, I walk in and it looks like this, cueing Jen. And of course, I say a WTF. Sometimes I might roll my eyes, but I do that, in private so nobody can see it. But my thought is, when I see something like this, okay, what's the function? I need to know what the function of the behavior is. And in many times, they've defined a function, and I'm still getting a call. A lot of times, it's because they don't have the interventions set up. They're, something's missing. Sometimes you need to dig a little deeper. And quite often, we have functions that are being misdiagnosed. I came across 2 years ago a kid that was stealing, and I can tell you most of the time stealing is a kid wants something, so they figured they've got this. So they're kind of trying to address it, making sure. He was stealing food at first, then he switched to stealing other things, and nothing was correcting the behavior. They were not seeing behavior change. So I kind of did a little more digging deeper and sort of followed the kid and watched things. And there was always a consequence to his behavior. And one thing I do tell schools, that if you are not seeing behavior change when you have an intervention or a consequence, then you need to change it. If it's not working within 2 weeks and you think it's going to, you got to do something different, because it's you that is not implementing it correctly, or it's not going to work for this student. So what I did notice is they had him eat lunch in the classroom. They thought that this might help because he could talk to the teacher, develop more of a one-on-one relationship. That didn't work. When he started stealing, and she could make sure he was eating. When he started stealing other things, they're like, well, let's kind of teach him the value of things, have him earn prizes and stuff like that, and maybe help out the teacher. They were really looking at getting that relationship building down, which is fabulous. Except one thing I noticed in common is every time they did this, he was missing out on socialization with peers. And that was what was driving the behavior. He was not comfortable in those open settings. And so we needed to work on that and start, because one time they were like, I was like, let's see what happens if we just kind of let it happen. And he was like, comes up to the teacher and says, hey, I took this. Shouldn't I stay in recess and help you out? And she's like, okay, that's weird, which it is. So basically, we started a different intervention, and we had him work on his peer relationships and gave him buddies that would help him interact with other people. But just because it looks like one thing doesn't mean it is that thing. So next slide. Other way, yep. So there are typically 4 functions of behavior. Some people stretch it out, but for the most part, the easiest to remember is the seat: sensory, escape, attention, tangible. The next slide, I'm going to go into each of them a little bit more. So we will start with the sensory. Sensory behaviors occur because people want access. Or they want to avoid it, but it's something that either feels good or feels bad. It is things like tapping. That might feel good to a person. Covering their ears. They're avoiding the sound. They might not like a smell, but it really is something. They might not like their chair. It's a sensory based. And the basic thing to do for this, we'll talk about that next, but we see these behaviors all the time. There is nothing that sets them off except for if lunch is loud, it might always happen at lunch when somebody doesn't like that noise level. The important thing to remember with the sensory behaviors is they are doing them because they need to. So trying to teach them to stop something can be challenging, and we need to look for a functional replacement behavior that will provide a compatible input or teach the lesson to lessen the impact of it. And sometimes we need to actually work on the teacher. I had a student that paced back and forth, and it drove the teacher nuts. It did not bother a single student in the classroom. They're like, oh yeah, that's him. He just does that. But that teacher was like, we've got to get him to stop it. And so, we're here for the kids. Sometimes it's going to be hard. And I'm like, okay, well, what if we had him pacing over here? So it's really just a peripheral type of thing. That worked. We changed the direction of his pacing. So it's not always something that you're going to be able to change in a kid. You need to kind of look at the function and make sure that if you are replacing it, it's for the betterment of the child, not for you. Next slide. Amy, I like your pacing trail. Good job. So to tell if you've got a sensory behavior happening, would this happen alone? And this is easy to test. I mean, watch the kid. Is he doing it when no one's around? Do they need that sensory input? Sometimes these behaviors can, be things like writhing of the hands. That looks like something the kid needs to be doing. And does it seem to be something they enjoy doing? There's a lot of fidgets that I use in classrooms, just like Jen's one. She enjoys her fidget. And we don't try to take it away from her. We make it socially acceptable. So that's something she enjoyed? Does it seem to be that they are avoiding something? If they don't like the smell of something in your room and they're like trying to bury their nose in it, that is going to be telling you something. And one thing to keep in mind when you are digging deeper, these can be your most dangerous behaviors, because many of our self-injurious behaviors are kids looking for a sensory input, and it can be scary. So they do need to be addressed. And sometimes we are looking at replacing a behavior that may not seem like something you would necessarily teach a child. There was a kid that really liked deep impact, and we set up a trampoline in the classroom because that impact was so important. And without that type of impact, he was like kicking himself. And so we were able to get a different behavior that still got a really good impact for him, but did not hurt himself. Next slide. There are many interventions, and I'm going to briefly go over these, but then at the end we do, if I've missed anything, we have, I have a little Excel file that kind of matches intervention with behavior. One good thing about these interventions to think of is these are all tier 1 interventions. These are all ones that you can use with your entire classroom and should be using with your entire classroom. If they are not working, you may need deeper ones. And you know what? We're going to get into that when we do our full-blown year-long segment of the art of being human. But for now, the tier 1 basic ones. So scheduled exercise. Kind of a challenge this past year, but it can be done even with kids that can't move as much. Modifying your environment. If you have a kid that does not like the seat they sit in, get them a little cushy seat. That will help. You can give visual cues to remind a kid that is tapping their pencil that, you know, can you be quiet for a little bit right now? Reward program can work in a sensory-based behavior depending on how you set it up. If you say, hey, can you not tap while I'm teaching? And if you don't tap while I'm teaching, I'm going to give you a prize. That may be incentive enough. Kids respond very well to positive-based interventions. The last one is tolerance training. And I try very much to be preparing these kids that we work with for the real world. And the real world does not always have modified lighting. It does not always have scent-free rooms. If you have a kid that has a severe allergy, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a kid that just doesn't like the smell. So, you know, or the lighting. Okay, well, can we have the lighting dimmed for 5 minutes of silent reading and then we'll turn it on? And you build up that tolerance. And the tolerance training is a great thing to work at teaching your kids things that they might find adversive, because there are so many things in the real world that they are going to come across that are not going to be able to be changed or modified to meet their needs. And so it's a good thing to work on with your students in your classroom. Next. Are escape-based behaviors. Quite often, these are academic-based. They are behaviors that will remove an undesired task, sometimes a person, sometimes a situation. But quite often, we are talking about you know, a task demand. They don't want to do math. It can happen whenever the task demand is placed on them. And it can often be, it quite often is the one that people reinforce in the most inappropriate way, because your child that starts screaming in math and you send them out of the room, they didn't want to do math in the first place. The kid who is always misbehaving and gets sent home, they may not have wanted to be at school at all. So make sure that if someone is trying to escape from something and you're letting them escape, then, I mean, I don't like to say they're getting their way, because that's not the point. They're meeting that need in a way that they don't need to. And so what we are there to do is to help them. We are going to do a lot of different things to support them, teach them to request a break down tasks, give activity choices, however we can make things more inviting for them. Next slide. So is this individual when the task is prevented? Every day you pull out math, here it is. Does it start almost immediately? Can it be almost timed to, okay, during math, this kid's gonna have a problem every time? Transitions are a big one, because a lot of times they don't know what's coming up. So make sure that, you're practicing those. And I know we can't always mix up our day, but we certainly can prepare kids for what's coming next and let them know that help is available, or that you can break things down for them. Sometimes as easy as simply giving them one sheet of paper as opposed to a packet of work is extremely effective. Do they engage when a stimuli they perceive is adversive is present? Now, this can quite often be a person. So if they have a substitute teacher that they don't like, or maybe it is just any substitute teacher, that might be something that they do not want to spend the day in the classroom for. And we need to prepare kids for things like that. So if it's these kids that we hear of, oh, they don't do well with subs, you got to dig a little deeper. And why don't they do well with subs? Well, they're trying to escape the situation, and continuing them to escape when there is a sub there is not serving them very well, because we do not always get the same waitress at the restaurant we love. So you need to figure a way to make that less adversive. Can they go in with a friend? Can they have a special duty if a sub is there? So those are things that are very important to realize, that if it is a person and they perceive it, this is not an adversive person, but then we need to make sure that we can make that a welcoming environment for them. And does the behavior end if the student leaves the activity, or if the person leaves the room? That is more than likely an escape-based behavior. Next one. So one of our list for these ones, of course, exercise, always a great thing, because it really kind of gets our mind going. The behavior momentum is a tactic that I kind of like to call Simon Says. And what you're doing is you're keeping a fast pace of things that are easy for students to do, and mixing them in with things that might be more challenging for them. So on a spelling test, you might start with, okay, everyone grab a pencil. Now put the pencil on top of your head. Now put the pencil in your left hand or your right hand and switch it. Now write your name on the paper and number it from 1 to 10. And keep kind of doing that rhythm until pretty soon they're taking a spelling test. It is very effective. If you've never tried it, it is amazing the things that you can get a kid to do, because you're just playing a game with them and you're interjecting an occasional task that you would like them to do. And in the meanwhile, they're really not doing much. Twirl your pencil around like I'm doing, but it does work. You can even get them to stand up and spin around. Their mind is not focusing and not stressing over the task at hand. Pre-teaching works very well. Let them know what they're about to do and what might be challenging. There are a lot of kids who get anxiety if they know they're going to be called on. So rather than call on your students randomly, let a kid know that, hey, you know what? Let's go over question number 5 here, because I'm going to call on you, and let you share it with them. So I want to kind of hear what you have to say about it, because, you know, this is something I know you are capable of doing. Great way of doing it. You've also had some one-on-one time with the kid and been able to positive reinforce their ability to do tasks. Modifying environment. This is things that, you know, maybe, like I said, with the stack of paper, that's an environmental change. If everybody gets a packet, and I can understand that can be hard to keep track of, but one kid gets one piece of paper as opposed to the other, it's a modification of the environment. Scheduling breaks, reducing task demands. There are kids that are not going to want to do full things of assignments because they figure that, you know, I just did 5 of them, so you know I can do this. And, you know, if you feel like they have demonstrated proficiency, might not always work, but it's not a bad thing to let them know that. To give them preferred items, you know, let them hold a fidget while they're working on something. Let them write in different writing utensils. I have worked with students that hate writing with pencils, and so I have found a vast assortment of erasable pens out there that are wonderful, and they help with kids who may not have, and which is also a sensory thing. The tolerance training again works here. Giving your kids choices, always great thing to do. Instead of just, hey, we're doing math, do you want to do this worksheet or this worksheet? And the reward program, again, I'm going to tell you, a reward program works for about any type of behavior as long as it's taught to work with the behavior you're looking for. And next slide. So this is my cute little slide, but talks about how attention needs to kind of change, because here these kids are just cute and they have to start getting more attention by screaming. We'll move into the attention after that one. So these are pretty common and typically referred to as our acting out behaviors. And one thing you have to remember is these kids might be acting out, but if they're looking for attention, that kind of makes me sad, because if that works for them in a classroom, then, you know, they're not probably getting enough attention in other situations. So in absence of positive reinforcement, kids will be okay with negative attention. And that's why we really need to make sure that we're giving them attention for positive stuff. So how do we do that when a kid is screaming and you are there all the time? Can we go back? Okay. One thing is we're going to teach them to request and receive positive attention. And now the next slide. I knew there was, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. Thank you. So to really tell if it is attention based, because like I said, just because it's acting out doesn't mean it's attention. Does attention follow the behavior? Is it pretty regular? And sometimes you'll have the kid that kind of looks at you, gives you the, you know, I'm about to scream for you. And do they smile before it? Another thing that often feeds this attention is not you, but other students in the classroom. So keep in mind that even if you are not paying attention to it, it could still be receiving attention from others. And that could be what is maintaining the behavior. So next slide. A lot of the interventions are the same, but our proximity control usually can help because we're there. We've got scheduled breaks. That's giving you a chance to give them attention. Same with reward. Contingent praise it's very important to keep in mind that your contingent praise needs to be behavior specific. And tolerance training, peer modeling, that's another way of giving them attention, as are the newsletters and reward programs. If you want to do the ignoring extinction, one thing to keep in mind is if you do this, behavior will typically get worse before it gets better. So be prepared for that. Next, tangible-based behaviors. These are typically, I talked about the stealing. The kids want something. Quite often, they want access to a computer. It's still considered a tangible thing, even if it is not something they can touch. Next one. Does the individual's behavior end when they're given the item or activity? And that's a real clear thing. You know, you scream, you want the computer, you get it. Do they ask or request the item? Does the behavior occur after it's clear that they cannot have it? And does the behavior occur when the item isn't given fast enough? Those are all things to look at. Keep in mind that most of these behaviors, they're there for a reason. They work. These are successful, and I don't like the word maladaptive, but successful maladaptive behaviors. So kids that scream and continually get what they want, it's working for them. Next slide. Not a lot for tangibles because these kids want things. The only thing I really added was fidgets, which could also be done with our, in fact, I was going to change that, but I forgot to today. But it also could be done with our sensory-based ones. But it's a tough behavior because there's a lot of want in this world. And it's hard to kind of deal with that. But again, talking about the idea that these are learned behaviors, they learned them incorrectly. One thing that I remember, we all learn things incorrectly. I was up in Vancouver when they just put in that new metro whatever thing. And I kept writing it thinking, this is the coolest thing ever. I never paid for it. I was just following the crowd. And then one day I saw somebody with a little tag and I'm like, what is that? And they're like, oh, that's the ticket. You know, there's a kiosk. And I'm like, holy crap, I've been writing for free for a whole week and I had no idea. So it happens. We learn things wrong. I was being reinforced because I got on the train, I went, nobody stopped me. Apparently, if somebody does stop you, they can ask you for your ticket, of which I did not have. But the same thing goes with these kids. These behaviors work. So we are going to make them not work. And we're doing that in a positive way of teaching them something else. So next slide. A lot of times they're not going to like us because we figured out that their things work. And it might have been easier because it certainly was easier for me to just get on the train without getting a ticket. But, you know, I had to figure it out the right way and I started paying. But it is something that we can do. And next one, replacement behaviors, very important. They need to serve the same function. We're looking at something that gets rid or that does the same function as the one that is unwanted. It must be acceptable. So when you're sitting there going, okay, well, I don't want this kid talking out in class. What I'm going to do is have him raise his hand. So he's going to raise his hand 50 times and you're going to answer him every time because you have to reinforce the replacement behavior. So think of something that you are okay with. Incompatible behaviors are the best. So an example I have, if you have a kid that's touching everything on the walls in the hallway and sometimes ripping them down, have kids walk through the hallway like this. It's not just cute, it's effective. So it makes the behavior ineffective and it must be taught and practiced when a kid is calm, and it must be modeled in many different environments. Next slide. So this is my little easy quick flow chart. It's this, what can I try? It will be in your slide deck to look through them all. And so here we talk about behavior. This poor little kitty thought he was doing the right thing, and he wasn't. A lot of our kids, the behavior they're doing, it works for them. And so it's not that they are trying to be bad. It's not that they are making bad choices. They are using what works to communicate to us their needs. And we need to make sure that we're not punishing them, but we are teaching them the right way to get our attention. And it's everybody is capable of doing it. It is something that we will continue to teach you throughout the year. And we do it so that you do not have dead birds on your desk. And I'll turn it over to Carrie now.
I'm chuckling because Karen used the analogy of a mouse yesterday instead of a dead bird. And I told her that I think there was a book by like Ronald Dahl. I may be wrong on the author. I probably should have looked it up last night. But anyhow, that just makes me chuckle. All right, so we are hoping to stay connected with all of you. Tammy is dropping the link in the chat again for the Google form where we will collect your information, but that is to share resources and opportunities with you. If you have enjoyed our presentation today, we are also going to drop the PD Enroller link in there so that you can join us for the rest of the year. We are hoping that you left today understanding that all behavior is communication and that it is controlled by the neurological processes that are developed in response to the experiences we all have in life, good or bad. And understanding and shaping that behavior requires a granular perspective that is rooted in a developmental relationship, and that you will pursue that, and that this has informed some practice for you going forward. We thank you for your time and for choosing to be with us today. And we just welcome any questions. We have just a few minutes left before they cut us off, but we are happy to answer any questions you have in the meantime. And we hope that you will join us to further explore having the art of humanity, or the art of being human, but the art of humanity being what defines your classroom.
It does, doesn't it, Amber? They both tied together. Yes. And we finished on time. I have to say, with 4 of us and all of us, the high fives.
Yeah.
Coincidence? Yeah, well, what do they say about coincidences? Nope.
I was actually just mouthing it, but I said they don't happen.
Oh, well, this was a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to the sessions. So,
is there a time when mental health issues might be considered?
I believe in our will be addressing mental health issues. How to fit that in 2 hours. We will be interweaving as much as we can because it is a very important part of our going forward. So yes, we will in our PD sessions. I mean, what Tammy is typing, that's when we will be addressing it. And it's not that we'll necessarily spend an entire one on them, but there will be mental health interwoven in it because it is a very important issue that needs to be discussed and addressed in schools.
And not just for our students, I would say, for the adults too. We all know that fatigue, let alone the stress that this last year has put on us, and returning from a pandemic and all of that. There's going to be a lot of healing to do for all of us, and it will influence our relationships and our social emotional well-being. And so, yeah, I think it definitely has a role in what we're going to be doing.